Farmer finds black eggs, but when they hatch, he starts crying. Thomas Grayson had been a farmer all his life. He inherited his land from his father, just as his father had before him. A simple man with a love for the earth, he had seen many strange things over the years, calves born with extra limbs, crops growing in bizarre shapes, but nothing prepared him for what he found one chilly morning in late autumn. It started like any other day. The golden sun was peeking over the horizon as Thomas trudged across his land, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. He was on his way to the old chicken coop when he noticed something unusual near the barn. There, nestled between stacks of hay bales, were a cluster of eggs, black as coal and smooth as polished stone. His brow furrowed. Chickens didn't lay eggs like this. No bird he knew of did. Kneeling, he picked one up. It was warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so. A shiver ran down his spine, but curiosity overpowered his unease. Carefully, he collected the eggs and brought them inside. That night, he placed them in an incubator, unsure if they needed warmth like any regular eggs. Days passed, and Thomas checked on them constantly. Then, on the fifth night, as a storm raged outside, the eggs began to crack. Thomas held his breath as he watched. One by one, small beaks poked through. But when the creatures inside fully emerged, he staggered backward, nearly knocking over his chair. They weren't birds. At first glance, they looked like tiny, writhing lizards, their bodies covered in glistening black scales. Their eyes were luminous, almost too large for their heads, glowing faintly in the dim room. And then, as if sensing his presence, they turned their heads in perfect unison to look at him. Thomas gasped. The creatures blinked, and something about them struck him deep in his chest, not fear, but an overwhelming emotion he couldn't explain. Then one of them, smaller than the rest, let out a high-pitched chirp and stumbled toward him, nuzzling against his rough, calloused hand. That was when the tears came. Thomas had lost his wife years ago, and the loneliness had settled into his bones like an old wound. He had long since resigned himself to silence, to the empty fields and the quiet of an empty house. But now, these tiny beings, whatever they were, looked at him with trust, as if they had chosen him, as if they belonged to him. Over the next few weeks, the creatures grew rapidly. Their tiny wings, which had been stubs at birth, stretched out, revealing delicate membranes. They were dragons, or something like them. The thought should have terrified him, but it didn't. They followed him around the farm, perching on his shoulders, curling up by the fire at night, and chirping in delight when he fed them. One evening, as Thomas sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the hills, he realized something profound. For the first time in years, his farm didn't feel empty. His heart didn't feel empty. He had found something he never expected to find again. A family. As the weeks passed, Thomas devoted himself to raising the mysterious creatures. They grew at an astonishing rate, their black scales shimmering under the sunlight, their wings stretching wider each day. They were intelligent, far too intelligent for ordinary animals. They learned quickly, responding to his voice, understanding his emotions, and even showing signs of deep affection. The smallest one, the one that had nuzzled him first, had a unique trait, a silver stripe running down its spine. Thomas named him Ember. Unlike his siblings, Ember seemed to possess a deeper connection to Thomas, often curling up at his feet or perching on his shoulder as he worked. But with their growth came changes to the farm. The other animals grew restless. The horses neighed nervously whenever the creatures were near. The chickens stopped laying eggs. Even the wind seemed to carry an eerie hum, as if whispering secrets through the trees. Then, one evening, something happened that changed everything. Thomas was preparing for bed when a sudden knock echoed through the farmhouse. His heart pounded. No one ever came this far out, especially not at night. Grabbing an old shotgun, he approached the door and cautiously pulled it open. A stranger stood in the moonlight. He was an older man, draped in a long coat, his silver hair gleaming under the stars. His eyes, sharp and knowing, scanned Thomas before shifting toward the barn. "You have them, don't you?" the man asked, his voice a low rumble. Thomas tightened his grip on the shotgun. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man sighed, shaking his head. "You found the eggs. And now, they've hatched." He stepped forward. "Listen to me, farmer. Those creatures, they are not meant to be here." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, then spoke. "Those eggs were not from this time. They are remnants of something ancient, something that should have stayed buried." He looked at Thomas with an urgency that made the farmer's stomach knot. "Did they hatch on the fifth night?" Thomas swallowed. "Yes." The man closed his eyes. "Then it's already begun." Before Thomas could demand an explanation, a deafening shriek pierced the night air. a sound so unnatural, so filled with power, that the very ground seemed to tremble. Thomas spun around, his heart racing. From the barn, Ember and his siblings stood in the moonlight, their wings fully unfurled. But their eyes were glowing brighter than ever before. And in the distant hills, beyond the farm, came a second shriek, one that did not belong to them. Something else had woken up. To be continued. The earth trembled beneath Thomas's feet. The distant shriek, inhuman, ancient, echoed through the hills, sending a cold dread through his bones. Whatever had made that sound was coming. The stranger turned to Thomas, his expression grim. They were never meant to hatch here. Their presence has disturbed the balance. The others, they have awakened. The others, Thomas whispered. The man pointed toward the hills. There were more eggs. Buried long ago. Your dragons, they're not the only ones rising. As if on cue, Ember let out a sharp cry. His black scales shimmered like liquid shadow as he spread his wings. His siblings followed, their glowing eyes locked on the horizon where the shriek had come from. The wind howled, and Thomas felt a pull in his chest, an unspoken connection with these creatures he had raised. Then, from the darkness beyond the fields, it emerged. A massive, towering form, unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. A beast with scales the color of storm clouds, eyes burning like molten gold. Its wings stretched wide, casting a shadow over the land, and when it opened its mouth, the air itself seemed to tremble. The stranger's voice was barely above a whisper. A wraith dragon. Thomas knew, deep in his soul, that this creature was not just another dragon. It was something worse. Something old. Something filled with fury. The wraith dragon let out another scream, shaking the ground, and then it charged. The battle begins. Ember reacted first, taking to the sky with his siblings. The young dragons were smaller, outmatched in size, but they did not hesitate. They moved as one, diving at the beast, their bodies shimmering like streaks of night against the moon. The wraith dragon swiped at them, missing by inches. It breathed out a dark, swirling mist, and when it touched the barn, the wood rotted instantly. Thomas stumbled back, barely avoiding the creeping decay. This wasn't just any dragon. It was a creature of death itself. The stranger grabbed his arm. They can't do this alone. They need you. What am I supposed to do? Thomas shouted. The man placed a hand over Thomas's chest, just above his heart. They chose you. That means you have a bond with them. Call them back. Guide them. Thomas turned toward Ember, his heart pounding. The little dragon, his dragon, was locked in a desperate battle, darting through the sky as the wraith dragon snapped its massive jaws. And then, Thomas called his name. Ember. The moment he spoke, something shifted. Ember turned, his eyes locking onto Thomas's, and a flood of understanding passed between them. A deep, primal instinct. The dragon cried out, and suddenly, his body began to glow. The same happened to his siblings. One by one, their black scales shimmered, their glowing eyes intensifying. Their wings pulsed with power. The wraith dragon hesitated. Ember roared, and together, the young dragons unleashed a burst of light. A blinding explosion erupted from their bodies, striking the wraith dragon in the chest. It let out a terrible, ear-piercing scream as cracks spread across its body, its form breaking apart like shattered stone. With one final, echoing cry, the wraith dragon vanished into the night. Silence fell. The only sound left was the wind whispering through the trees. The new beginning. Thomas collapsed to his knees, breathless, watching as Ember and his siblings landed beside him. They nudged him gently, their scales warm, their glowing eyes filled with something more than instinct, love. The stranger let out a long sigh. It is done. Thomas looked up at him. What were they? The man smiled faintly. The guardians of an old world. They were never meant to be alone. And now, neither are you. Thomas looked at Ember, at the creatures he had raised, fought for, and nearly lost. He understood now. He had not just found the eggs. He had found his purpose. As the sun began to rise over the farm, Thomas knew his life would never be the same, and he wouldn't have it any other way. The end.